Some mysteries are buried so deep that digging them up changes the very ground you stand on. The fluorescent lights hummed like dying insects in the Blackwater County evidence room, casting harsh shadows across rows of moldering case files. Dr. Elena Vasquez pulled her reading glasses down her nose as she opened the manila folder marked Varkun incident to 1982, expecting another routine cold case review for the State Forensics Board. Instead, she found herself staring at DNA analysis reports that made her question 40 years of genetic research. 7 boys, ages 8 to 14, discovered living in a makeshift camp deep in the Cascade Wilderness. Filthy, malnourished, speaking in a dialect no linguist could identify. But it was their blood work that stopped Elena cold. The chromosomal patterns showed markers that didn't exist in human genetics, cellular structures that suggested regenerative capabilities beyond anything in medical literature, and most disturbing of all, genetic sequences that matched no known life form on Earth. As rain drummed against the windows and thunder rolled across the Oregon mountains, Elena realized she wasn't just reviewing a cold case. She was uncovering evidence that humanity might not be alone after all. What happened to those 7 boys who vanished from state custody, and why did their impossible DNA haunt her dreams? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena set the DNA reports aside with trembling hands, her coffee long cold in the styrofoam cup beside her elbow. The evidence room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as she absorbed the implications of what she'd just read. 40 years of forensic genetics, and she'd never seen cellular structures like these, mitochondrial sequences that spiraled in impossible configurations, telomeres that appeared to self-repair rather than degrade. She rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar ache that came with too many late nights spent chasing ghosts in genetic code. At 52, Elena had reviewed hundreds of cold cases for the State Forensics Board, applying modern DNA analysis to decades-old evidence. Most files yielded predictable results: contaminated samples, degraded chains, occasionally a match that brought closure to grieving families. This was different. This was wrong. The photographs scattered across the metal table showed 7 boys huddled around a crude fire pit, their faces gaunt but alert, eyes that seemed far older than their years. According to the incident report, hikers had discovered them living in a network of caves near Mount Jefferson, subsisting on a diet of roots, insects, and small game. The children claimed they belonged to something called the Varkun clan, but refused to elaborate beyond insisting they needed to return to the deep places before the calling time. Social services had placed them in separate foster homes across 3 counties, standard protocol to prevent group dynamics that might impede integration. Within 6 weeks, all 7 had vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. The case had gone cold faster than a campfire in winter rain. But the medical examinations conducted during their brief time in custody painted a picture that defied everything Elena understood about human physiology. Dr. Marcus Webb's notes described wounds that healed within hours, bone density readings that exceeded normal parameters by 30%, and most disturbing of all, vocal cord structures that appeared capable of producing subsonic frequencies below the range of human hearing. Elena pulled out her tablet and cross-referenced the genetic markers against every database she had access to. CODIS, GenBank, even classified military archives her security clearance barely covered. Each search returned the same result: no matches found. It was as if these children belonged to a species that had never been catalogued, studied, or acknowledged by mainstream science. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows like fingers tapping impatiently on glass. Elena found herself thinking about her daughter Sarah, who would have been 32 now if she hadn't disappeared during a camping trip 15 years ago. Different circumstances, different outcome, but the same crushing weight of unanswered questions. She flipped through the behavioral assessments, noting how the boys had demonstrated an uncanny ability to locate underground water sources and navigate in complete darkness. Foster families reported finding them sleeping in basements or crawl spaces rather than the beds provided. One child, identified only as Subject 3, had been observed communicating with the family dog through low frequency, humming that seemed to calm the animal's aggressive tendencies. The final page of the file contained a handwritten note from Sheriff Martin Blackwater, dated 3 weeks after the last disappearance. Whatever those kids were, they weren't meant for our world. Maybe it's better they found their way back to wherever they came from. Elena's breath caught. She recognized the sheriff's name from her own case files. Blackwater had been the responding officer when Sarah vanished near Crater Lake, a coincidence that felt anything but coincidental. She opened her laptop and pulled up the digital scans of evidence from her daughter's disappearance. Hair samples, partial footprints, trace DNA found on Sarah's abandoned backpack. Elena had analyzed this material countless times over the years, searching for patterns that might explain what happened that night. Now, with the Varkun files spread before her, she began running comparative analysis between the two cases. The results appeared on her screen 30 minutes later, and Elena's world tilted on its axis. Genetic markers from the 1982 boys matched DNA traces found at Sarah's campsite, not perfectly, but with enough similarity to suggest biological relationship, family, descendants, evolution. Her hands shook as she printed the comparison charts, the evidence room suddenly too bright, too small, too real. Outside, thunder cracked like the sound of foundations splitting. Elena stared at the data that suggested her daughter's disappearance wasn't random, wasn't the work of a human predator, but something else entirely. Something that had been moving through the forests of Oregon for decades, possibly longer. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across the photographs of 7 impossible children. Elena gathered the files with mechanical precision, her mind racing through implications she wasn't ready to accept. She needed to dig deeper, needed to find out what happened to the Varkun boys, needed to understand the connection to Sarah's case. But as she locked the evidence room door behind her and walked through the empty hallways of the sheriff's department, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just investigating a mystery anymore. She was walking directly into one. The drive home through the winding roads of Blackwater County passed in a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and swaying Douglas firs. Elena's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, the printed comparison charts sitting in her passenger seat like a passenger she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Every few miles, her eyes drifted to the papers, their implications gnawing at the edges of her carefully constructed world. Her house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, a modest ranch-style home she'd bought after the divorce. After David couldn't handle her obsession with finding Sarah, couldn't understand why she spent every weekend hiking the same trails, analyzing the same evidence, chasing the same ghosts. The porch light cast a weak circle of illumination against the storm, and Elena felt the familiar pang of loneliness that had become her most reliable companion. Inside, the silence felt heavier than usual. Elena moved through her evening routine with automatic precision, keys on the hook by the door, files locked in her home office safe, a dinner of microwaved leftovers eaten standing at the kitchen counter while rain hammered the windows. The walls displayed her life in careful increments, her doctorate from UC Davis, commendations from the Oregon State Police, photographs from conferences where she'd presented papers on forensic genealogy, a successful career built on the foundation of other people's tragedies. But it was the photograph on her desk that drew her attention as she settled into her home office. Sarah, at 17, blonde hair catching sunlight during their last camping trip together. The same forests where 7 impossible children had once hidden in caves, where DNA evidence suggested connections that challenged everything Elena thought she knew about the natural world. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, her research partner at the state lab. Coffee tomorrow. Need to discuss the Henderson case. Elena stared at the message, realizing she'd have to maintain the pretense of normalcy while her mind wrestled with genetic sequences that defied classification. Marcus had been trying to ask her out for months, approaching the subject with the careful patience of someone who understood grief's timeline wasn't dictated by social expectations. She typed back, "Rain check? Working on something big." The response felt inadequate, but how could she explain that she was potentially sitting on evidence of a non-human species living in Oregon's wilderness? That her daughter's disappearance might be connected to children who could heal from wounds in hours and communicate through subsonic frequencies? Elena opened her laptop and began researching Sheriff Martin Blackwater, the man whose name appeared in both case files. The obituary from 2018 described him as a dedicated public servant who'd spent 37 years protecting Blackwater County, survived by a daughter, Rebecca Blackwater Chen, now serving as a federal agent with the Fish and Wildlife Service. No mention of unusual cases or unexplained disappearances that had marked his tenure. The rain intensified, and Elena found herself thinking about the life she'd built in the aftermath of loss. Her twice-weekly dinners with her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd become a surrogate mother figure. The hiking group she'd joined but attended sporadically, always finding excuses when the trails ventured too close to areas connected with Sarah's case. The careful balance between professional success and personal isolation that had protected her from further heartbreak. She'd convinced herself that solving Sarah's disappearance would restore some sense of purpose, would justify the years of emotional distance she'd maintained from everyone who tried to care about her. David used to say she loved mysteries more than people, and Elena had never been able to argue the point effectively. Cases didn't leave you, didn't get frustrated with your obsessions, didn't demand emotional availability you couldn't provide. But now, staring at genetic evidence that suggested her daughter's fate was tied to something beyond human understanding, Elena felt the foundations of her controlled existence shifting. The Varkun boys represented more than just another cold case. They were proof that the world contained possibilities she'd never imagined, dangers she'd never considered. Her phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson's name appeared on the screen, and Elena felt a rush of guilt for forgetting their weekly check-to-in call. "Elena, dear, I just wanted to make sure you made it home safely. This storm is quite something." "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson. Just catching up on work." "You always say that. When's the last time you had a proper meal with another human being?" Elena smiled despite herself. "I'll cook dinner for us this weekend, promise." After hanging up, Elena realized how easily she could lose herself entirely in this investigation. Her job at the State Forensics Lab, her small circle of colleagues and friends, the fragile routine that kept her functioning, all of it felt suddenly precarious. The Varkun case demanded the kind of total commitment that had already cost her a marriage and countless relationships. But as she locked away the files and prepared for bed, Elena acknowledged the truth that had been building since she'd first seen those impossible DNA sequences. She was going to pursue this investigation wherever it led, regardless of what it might cost her. Mysteries chose their investigators, and Elena Vasquez had just been chosen by something that might redefine everything humanity thought it knew about itself. Elena woke to silence that felt wrong. The storm that had raged through the night had ended with the abruptness of a held breath released, leaving behind an unnatural stillness that made her skin crawl. Pale morning light filtered through her bedroom windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like microscopic specimens under her gaze. Her phone showed 17 missed calls. The first was from Marcus at 5:23 a.m., then Dr. Patricia Henley, her supervisor at the state lab, then Director Walsh from the Forensics Board. Elena's stomach clenched as she scrolled through the call log, numbers she recognized from the governor's office, the FBI regional division, even the CDC in Atlanta. Before she could decide which call to return first, her phone rang again. Director Walsh's name flashed on the screen. "Elena, thank God. We've been trying to reach you all night." Walsh's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before, a tremor that suggested his usual bureaucratic composure had cracked. "I need you at the lab immediately. Don't discuss this with anyone. Don't use your normal access codes. Ask for Dr. Reeves at the security desk. She'll escort you to conference room 7. What's happened? Not over the phone. How quickly can you get here?" Elena glanced at the clock. 45 minutes. If I leave now, make it 30. The line went dead. Elena stared at her phone, mind racing through possibilities. Had someone discovered her unauthorized access to the Varkun files? Was this about the genetic comparisons she'd run between the 1982 case and Sarah's evidence? Or something worse, something that connected her investigation to whatever had prompted 17 emergency calls before dawn? She dressed mechanically, her reflection in the bathroom mirror showing a woman who looked older than her 52 years. The files from her safe went into her briefcase alongside her laptop, though she suspected that whatever waited for her at the lab would render her private investigation irrelevant. The drive to Portland passed in a blur of empty highways and early morning mist. Elena's mind circled through scenarios, each more unsettling than the last. The CDC's involvement suggested biological concerns, infectious disease, genetic contamination, bioterrorism. But the governor's office implied political ramifications that extended far beyond public health. Dr. Susan Reeves waited in the lab's main lobby, her usually pristine appearance disheveled in ways that spoke of an all-night crisis. They'd worked together on the Willamette Valley serial killer case 3 years ago, but Elena had never seen the unflappable microbiologist look genuinely frightened. Elena Reeves' greeting carried relief, and something that might have been pity. "Before we go upstairs, I need to ask, have you discussed the Blackwater County cold case with anyone? Family, colleagues, friends?" The question confirmed Elena's worst fears, only in the most general terms. "Susan, what's—" "They found more children." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Reeves guided her toward the elevator with a steadying hand on her elbow, continuing in hushed tones as they ascended to the 7th floor. "Park rangers discovered them yesterday evening near Three Sisters Wilderness. 11 children this time, living in conditions similar to the 1982 case." "But Elena—" Reeves paused as the elevator doors opened, revealing a hallway filled with people in federal badges and military uniforms. "The DNA results came back 2 hours ago. Preliminary analysis shows genetic markers identical to samples you flagged in the system 3 days ago." Elena's briefcase felt suddenly heavy, weighted with files that had seemed like historical curiosities but now represented an active, ongoing phenomenon. Her unauthorized investigation had been not just discovered, but vindicated in the most terrifying way possible. Conference room 7 buzzed with controlled chaos. Maps covered the walls, marked with red pins that Elena recognized as locations from her Sarah files. Federal agents spoke in urgent whispers, while military personnel studied satellite imagery on multiple screens. At the center of it all sat a woman Elena had never met. Tall, Asian features, federal ID badge, reading Special Agent R. Blackwater Chen, the daughter of Sheriff Martin Blackwater, the same sheriff who'd worked both the Varkun case and Sarah's disappearance. "Dr. Vasquez." Agent Blackwater Chen rose from her seat, extending a hand that felt cold despite the room's warmth. "We need to talk about what you've discovered, and what you haven't told anyone yet." Elena shook the offered hand, acutely aware that everyone in the room was watching her reaction. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The genetic analysis you ran, comparing 1982 samples to evidence from your daughter's case. The cross-referencing you've been conducting through classified databases. The files you've been accessing outside normal channels." Elena's mouth went dry. They knew everything. But more than that, they'd been watching her investigation unfold, allowing her to make connections that should have triggered security protocols immediately. "We've been waiting 15 years for someone with your expertise to make these connections, Dr. Vasquez." Blackwater Chen gestured to an empty chair at the conference table. "The question now is whether you're prepared to learn why." Elena looked around the room at faces that reflected grim determination. and barely contained fear. Outside the conference room windows, the Oregon landscape stretched toward mountains where impossible children had been found twice in 40 years, and where her daughter had vanished into the same wilderness that seemed to harbor secrets older than human understanding. She had a choice: walk away from everything she'd discovered, return to her controlled existence of cold cases and routine analyses, preserve the small life she'd built from the wreckage of loss, or step forward into whatever truth these people represented, knowing it would change everything she thought she knew about the world, about her daughter's fate, about the nature of reality itself. Elena set her briefcase on the table and took the offered seat. "Tell me everything." The words hung in the air between them, "Tell me everything," and Elena immediately wanted to take them back. The conference room felt smaller now, the weight of assembled federal agents and military personnel pressing against her like a physical force. She'd spent 15 years chasing answers about Sarah's disappearance, but sitting here surrounded by people who clearly knew more than they were saying. Elena realized she'd been unprepared for the moment when those answers might actually come. "Before we begin," Agent Blackwater Chen said, settling into the chair across from Elena, "I need you to understand that what we're about to discuss is classified at the highest levels. Your signature on these documents will bind you to secrecy that extends beyond national security into other considerations." Elena stared at the papers sliding across the table toward her, dense legal text-filled pages that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the pen, not from fear of the government's reach, but from the terrifying possibility that signing these documents would irrevocably alter her relationship with the truth about Sarah. "What if I don't sign?" The question escaped before she could stop herself. The room fell silent. Agent Blackwater Chen exchanged glances with a graying man in military uniform whose nameplate read Colonel Morrison. Elena caught the subtle communication passing between them, disappointment, perhaps resignation. "Then you return to your normal duties at the state lab," Blackwater Chen replied carefully. "Your security clearance would be reviewed, of course. The Varkun files would be reclassified. Your access to certain databases would be modified." Elena understood the subtext. They would bury her professionally, exile her to routine paternity tests and insurance fraud cases. But more than that, they would ensure she never learned what had happened to Sarah, never discovered whether her daughter's fate connected to the impossible children found in Oregon's wilderness. She picked up the pen, then set it down again. "My daughter disappeared 15 years ago. I've spent every weekend since then hiking the same trails, analyzing the same evidence. I've sacrificed my marriage, my relationships, my peace of mind, chasing answers that everyone told me didn't exist. And now you're sitting here telling me those answers have been waiting in government files this whole time?" The accusation hung heavy in the air. Elena saw recognition in several faces around the room, not guilt exactly, but the weary acknowledgement of people who'd made difficult choices for what they believed were necessary reasons. "Dr. Vasquez," Colonel Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "Your daughter's case was classified because revealing the truth would have required acknowledging the existence of entities that our government wasn't prepared to discuss publicly. We've been hoping that someday we'd have enough information to approach families like yours, to provide answers without compromising national security." "Entities." Elena repeated the word, tasting its implications. Not people, not human children, but something else entirely. Something that required military involvement and CDC consultation and secrecy that spanned decades. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, who would worry if Elena didn't call tonight. About Marcus, still waiting for a response about coffee, still approaching their friendship with careful patience. About the hiking group that met every Thursday, well-meaning people who understood loss but couldn't fathom the specific hell of unanswered questions. All of it felt suddenly distant, like looking at her life through the wrong end of a telescope. The small routines and careful relationships that had sustained her through 15 years of grief seemed fragile as tissue paper compared to the weight of whatever truth waited on the other side of her signature. "The children found yesterday," Elena said slowly. "Are they still alive?" "Yes." "And the 11 from 1982? Agent Blackwater Chen's expression darkened. "That's complicated. Part of what we need to discuss." Elena closed her eyes, seeing Sarah's face from that last photograph, 17 years old, blonde hair catching sunlight, unaware that she would disappear into Oregon wilderness that harbored secrets older than human understanding. Her daughter had been gone for 15 years. What were a few more hours of not knowing weighed against the possibility of losing herself entirely in whatever truth these people represented. But even as the thought formed, Elena recognized its dishonesty. She'd already lost herself years ago, the night Sarah vanished and left behind only questions that ate away at everything Elena tried to build in their wake. Her careful isolation, her professional focus, her emotional distance from everyone who tried to care about her, all of it was just elaborate scaffolding holding up the empty space where answers should have been. Elena picked up the pen again, feeling the weight of 15 years of sleepless nights and weekend searches and genetic analyses run on samples that had yielded nothing but more questions. Outside the conference room windows, the Oregon mountains stretched toward horizons where her daughter had walked into mystery, and where impossible children had been hiding truths that might reshape humanity's understanding of itself. She signed her name with steady strokes, knowing she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return to the small, controlled life she'd built from the wreckage of loss. The ink was still wet on the signature when Agent Blackwater Chen stood and moved to the wall-mounted screens. Elena's hand remained frozen above the documents, pen still clasped between fingers that had just signed away her old life. The weight of what she'd committed to settled over her like lead, heavy and irrevocable. "Dr. Reeves, please secure the room," Blackwater Chen said. Elena heard the soft hiss of electronic locks engaging, the subtle change in air pressure that indicated they were now sealed inside whatever truth had been waiting for her signature. Colonel Morrison activated the largest screen, revealing satellite imagery that Elena recognized immediately, the Three Sisters Wilderness area where Sarah had vanished. But the timestamp showed yesterday's date, and red markers indicated recent activity across terrain Elena had hiked countless times in her futile searches. "The children we found are being held at a secure medical facility 2 hours from here," Blackwater Chen began, her voice taking on the cadence of a briefing she'd clearly given before. "Like the 1982 group, they demonstrate physiological anomalies that challenge fundamental assumptions about human biology. Enhanced healing rates, modified bone density, neurological structures that suggest capabilities we're only beginning to understand." Elena stared at the satellite images, her scientific mind already racing ahead to implications she wasn't sure she wanted to grasp. "You're saying they're not human?" "We're saying they're not entirely human," Morrison corrected. "DNA analysis indicates approximately 70% genetic overlap with baseline Homo sapiens. The remaining 30% contain sequences that don't match any known terrestrial species." The room spun slightly around Elena's peripheral vision. 30%. In genetic terms, that was a chasm. The difference between humans and chimpanzees was less than 2%. What they were describing wasn't just unusual, it was evolutionarily impossible unless... Where did they come from? Elena's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "That's what we've been trying to determine for 40 years, Blackwater Chen replied. "The 1982 children claimed to belong to something they called the Varkun clan. They spoke of others like them living in remote areas of the Pacific Northwest. When pressed for details, they described settlements that predated European colonization by centuries." Elena thought about her weekend hikes, the trails that had become pilgrimage routes in her search for Sarah. How many times had she passed within miles of whatever hidden communities these children had emerged from? How many nights had she camped under stars that looked down on secrets that might explain her daughter's disappearance? "The children from yesterday," Elena said carefully. "Do they know what happened to Sarah?" The silence that followed stretched too long. Elena saw Morrison and Blackwater Chen exchange another of their wordless communications, and her stomach clenched with the certainty that whatever came next would fundamentally alter how she understood her daughter's fate. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwater Chen said gently, "the children found yesterday were not living wild in the wilderness. They were being held in what appears to be a research facility built into the mountainside. A facility that shows evidence of decades-long occupation and sophisticated technological capabilities." The implications hit Elena like successive waves. A hidden research facility, decades of occupation. Technology advanced enough to remain undetected in wilderness areas that had been extensively searched. Her mind reeled through the possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. "You think Sarah found them," Elena said. "You think she stumbled onto this facility 15 years ago?" "We think Sarah was taken there," Morrison replied, "along with approximately 30 other individuals who've disappeared in the region over the past 4 decades. Elena's carefully constructed emotional barriers, the professional distance, the clinical focus on evidence over feeling, crumbled completely. For 15 years, she'd imagined her daughter lost in the wilderness, succumbing to exposure or accident or random violence. But this was worse. This suggested Sarah had spent years as a prisoner of beings whose nature and intentions remained utterly unknown. "Is she alive?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "We don't know," Blackwater Chen admitted. "The facility was abandoned when we found the children. But Dr. Vasquez, there's something else. Something that connects directly to your genetic analysis." Another screen activated, displaying DNA sequences Elena recognized from her own work. But now those familiar patterns were overlaid with additional data that made her breath catch in her throat. "The blood samples found at Sarah's disappearance site," Morrison continued. "The ones that never matched any known database. They're genetically identical to the Varkun children. All of them." Elena stared at the data, her scientific training warring with maternal grief that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. The evidence was undeniable. Sarah's blood had been mixed with samples from beings that challenged everything science understood about human evolution and genetic possibility. She was no longer Dr. Elena Vasquez, respected forensic geneticist with a tragic personal history. She was the mother of a girl who'd encountered something beyond human understanding, and whose fate was tied to mysteries that governments had been hiding for decades. There would be no returning to weekend dinners with Mrs. Patterson, no hiking groups or careful professional boundaries. Elena had crossed into territory where the only way forward led deeper into impossible truths. The silence stretched until Elena could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The DNA sequences on the screen blurred as tears she hadn't felt coming spilled down her cheeks. Sarah's blood mixed with something not quite human. 15 years of searching, and her daughter had been taken by beings that shouldn't exist. "I want to see them." Elena's voice came out stronger than she felt. "The children you found, I want to examine them myself." Morrison leaned forward. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand your emotional investment, but these entities present significant—" "They're children," Elena interrupted, surprising herself with the fierceness in her tone. "Whatever else they are, they're children who've been held against their will, and they might be the only link to finding my daughter." Agent Blackwater Chen studied Elena's face for a long moment, then nodded. "Dr. Chen, no relation, is the lead geneticist at the containment facility. She's been requesting additional expertise since the children arrived. Your background in forensic genetics could prove invaluable." Containment facility? The clinical terminology sent a chill through Elena. These are children, not specimens. "Children who can heal from injuries that should be fatal," Morrison said grimly, "who communicate through subsonic frequencies that can shatter glass when they're distressed. who demonstrate strength levels that required us to redesign our security protocols. Elena absorbed this, her scientific mind cataloguing the implications, while her maternal instincts recoiled from the idea of frightened children being treated as threats. Have you tried communicating with them, understanding what they need? Blackwater Chen activated another screen, showing video feed from what appeared to be a medical facility. Elena watched 11 children ranging in apparent age from 7 to 15, all sharing the same pale complexion and dark hair that marked them as siblings, or something more complex than siblings. They moved with fluid coordination, never quite touching but maintaining spatial relationships that suggested constant non-verbal communication. They respond to Dr. Chen, Blackwater Chen explained. She's the daughter of Korean immigrants, speaks multiple languages, and has training in xenobiology. The children seem to recognize her as less threatening than the rest of us. Elena watched the children on screen, noting their careful wariness, the way they positioned themselves for optimal escape routes, even in what appeared to be a comfortable medical environment. These weren't feral children or genetic anomalies. They were intelligent beings adapting to captivity with sophisticated survival strategies. I want Dr. Chen's contact information, Elena said, and I want to review every piece of evidence from the facility where you found them. Everything. There's a problem with that, Morrison interjected. The facility. It's not like anything in our technological database. The materials, the construction methods, the power systems, they suggest capabilities decades ahead of current human engineering, possibly centuries. The room felt suddenly smaller, the weight of impossible revelations pressing against Elena's understanding of reality. You're telling me that something has been living in the Oregon wilderness with technology that surpasses our own for generations. We're telling you that the Pacific Northwest may harbor civilizations that predate human settlement, Blackwater Chen confirmed, and that your daughter somehow became entangled with forces we're only beginning to comprehend. Elena closed her eyes, seeing Sarah's face again, not the 17-year-old from the last photograph, but as she might appear now, 32 years old, changed by experiences beyond human understanding. The hope and terror of that possibility warred in Elena's chest. Dr. Chen has requested permission to attempt communication with the children using linguistic models based on indigenous Pacific Northwest languages, Morrison continued. Your expertise in genetic analysis could help us understand not just what they are, but how they relate to the broader population we suspect exists in the region. Elena opened her eyes, focusing on the children on screen. One of them, a girl who appeared to be around 12, looked directly at the camera as if aware of being observed. For a moment, Elena felt the strange certainty that the child was looking directly at her, across miles and security systems and government classifications. When do we leave? Elena asked. Dr. Vasquez, Morrison's voice carried warning. Once you enter that facility, once you make direct contact with these entities, there will be no returning to your previous life. The psychological impact alone. My previous life ended 15 years ago when my daughter disappeared. Elena cut him off. Everything since then has just been marking time until I found answers. Now you're offering me those answers. She stood, gathering the signed documents and her briefcase with hands that had stopped trembling. The woman who'd entered this room an hour ago had been driven by grief and desperate hope. The woman preparing to leave was something harder, forged by the certainty that her daughter's fate lay with beings who challenged everything science thought it knew about the possible. I'll need 24 hours to arrange my affairs, Elena said. Then I want to meet Dr. Chen and examine these children, all of them. The threshold between her old life and whatever waited ahead had already been crossed. Now, there was only the question of how far into impossible truth she was willing to venture. Morrison stood as Elena reached for the door handle, his movement sharp enough to suggest she'd triggered some protocol she wasn't aware of. Dr. Vasquez, before you leave this room, There are practical matters we need to address." Elena turned back, briefcase still clutched against her chest like armor. The faces around the conference table had shifted into something more serious than even the revelations about non-human DNA had warranted. Agent Blackwater Chen was typing rapidly on a tablet, while Dr. Reeves watched Elena with the careful attention of someone evaluating a psychological profile in real time. "What kind of practical matters?" "Your 24 hours to arrange affairs," Morrison said. "That arrangement process will be supervised. For security reasons, you understand." The careful phrasing didn't mask the reality. She was about to become a prisoner of her own curiosity. Elena felt the weight of the signed documents in her briefcase, the irrevocable commitment she'd made without fully grasping its scope. Supervised how, exactly? Blackwater Chen looked up from her tablet. "Agent Martinez will accompany you home. You'll be able to contact your employer, handle immediate personal business, pack essentials. But all communications will be monitored, and you won't be able to discuss the nature of your departure." Elena thought about Marcus, probably still checking his phone for her response about coffee, about the hiking group expecting her Thursday, about Mrs. Patterson, who would worry if Elena simply vanished without explanation, the small constellation of people who'd tried to orbit her grief-darkened life for 15 years. "What do I tell them?" "Extended consulting work for the government," Morrison replied. "Dr. Reeves has prepared a cover story involving classified forensic analysis for an ongoing federal investigation, close enough to the truth to be believable." Dr. Reeves slid a folder across the table. "This contains the details you'll need. Duration unspecified, location classified, communication limited for security purposes. Your university has already been contacted about extended leave." Elena stared at the folder, understanding finally settling over her like cold water. They'd been planning this conversation long before she'd walked into the building. Her signature hadn't been the beginning of her involvement. It had been the formalization of something already decided. "How long have you been watching me?" she asked quietly. The silence that followed confirmed her suspicions. Blackwater Chen finally spoke, her voice carrying something that might have been sympathy. "Dr. Vasquez, your daughter's case has been under federal oversight since her disappearance. When someone with your expertise began conducting independent genetic analysis on evidence from a classified investigation, you've been monitoring my work, my lab results, everything." Morrison nodded. "We couldn't risk you publishing findings that might compromise ongoing operations, but your insights have been valuable. Dr. Chen specifically requested your involvement after reviewing your analysis of the blood samples." Elena felt the last foundations of her normal life crumbling, not just the future she was walking away from, but the past 15 years of what she'd believed was private research, personal quest for answers. All of it had been observed, catalogued, used to advance government understanding of mysteries they'd been hiding from families like hers. "My daughter," she said, voice barely controlled. "When she disappeared, you knew then what had probably taken her." "We suspected," Morrison admitted. "But Dr. Vasquez, you have to understand, revealing the existence of the Varkun population would have caused panic, religious upheaval, scientific paradigms collapsing overnight. The decision was made to handle these situations through classified channels until we better understood what we were dealing with." Elena opened the cover story folder, scanning details of her fictional assignment, while rage built behind her sternum. 15 years of searching empty wilderness, while government agents knew her daughter had encountered something beyond human understanding. 15 years of grief counseling and careful professional distance and weekend dinners with Mrs. Patterson, all built on a foundation of lies. "Agent Martinez is waiting outside," Blackwater Chen said gently. "She'll drive you home, help you handle the necessary arrangements. The process will be easier if you don't fight it." Elena looked around the conference room one final time, at the faces of people who'd spent decades managing impossible truths. Tomorrow she would enter a world where children with non-human DNA represented just the visible edge of mysteries that challenged everything she'd believed about reality. But tonight, She had to call Marcus and explain why she couldn't meet for coffee. Had to pack clothes for a journey with no defined endpoint. Had to look Mrs. Patterson in the eye and lie about extended government work while knowing she might never return to their quiet Thursday dinners. The woman who'd entered this room had been driven by grief and desperate hope. The woman preparing to leave carried the weight of understanding that her entire adult life had been shaped by secrets others had decided she wasn't ready to know. Elena gripped her briefcase tighter and walked toward whatever remained of the life she was about to abandon. Agent Martinez proved to be a compact woman in her 30s with kind eyes and the sort of professional demeanor that made surveillance feel almost companionable. She drove Elena's car while Elena sat in the passenger seat of her own vehicle, watching familiar streets pass by as if seeing them for the last time. "Your neighbor," Martinez said as they pulled into Elena's driveway. "Mrs. Patterson. She's on the porch." Elena's heart clenched. Mrs. Patterson stood watering her geraniums, but her attention was clearly focused on Elena's arrival. 15 years of Thursday dinners, of gentle check-ins during difficult anniversaries, of shared silence when words felt inadequate. Now Elena would have to look into those caring eyes and deliver a lie crafted by government handlers. "Dr. Vasquez?" Mrs. Patterson called as Elena climbed out of the car. "You're home early. And who's your friend?" "Work colleague," Elena replied, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "Patricia Martinez. We're collaborating on a project." Martinez offered a professional smile and a wave before following Elena to her front door. Elena fumbled with her keys, hyper-aware of Mrs. Patterson's concerned gaze. The simple act of unlocking her home, something she'd done thousands of times, felt monumental now that she knew she might never do it again. Inside, Elena's house felt like a museum of the life she was abandoning. Sarah's room remained exactly as it had been 15 years ago, preserved in hopeful amber. Family photographs tracked the progression from couple to parents to the hollow space left by loss. Books on forensic genetics lined her study walls alongside hiking guides for the Pacific Northwest, all the tools she'd used to build a careful existence around the crater Sarah's disappearance had left. "Take your time," Martinez said gently, settling into the living room chair that faced both the front door and the back exit. "But remember, nothing that could compromise operational security." Elena nodded and pulled out her phone. Marcus first. She stared at his contact information, remembering his invitation for coffee, his patient attempts to draw her back toward human connection. He deserved better than the recorded message she was about to leave. "Marcus, it's Elena. Something's come up. Extended consulting work for a federal investigation. I can't discuss details, and I'm not sure when I'll be back. Take care of yourself." She hung up before her voice could crack. Next, the university. Dr. Williams seemed unsurprised by her request for immediate extended leave, confirming what Elena already suspected. The arrangements had been made before she'd signed a single document. Then the hiking group. A Thursday evening commitment that had provided structure when everything else felt chaotic. She left a similar message about federal work, knowing they'd fill her spot easily enough. People came and went from those groups regularly, seeking temporary community in the wilderness. Mrs. Patterson required face-to-face deception. Elena found her neighbor still tending her garden, though the geraniums had been thoroughly watered 10 minutes ago. "Elena, dear, is everything all right? You seemed tense." "Government consulting work," Elena said, hating how easily the lie came. "They need my expertise on a classified case. I'll be away for a while, possibly months." Mrs. Patterson's face fell. "Oh, honey, right before Sarah's anniversary month, too." Elena's throat constricted. She'd forgotten. October was approaching, the month that marked Sarah's disappearance, 15 years of observing that horrible milestone together, and now Elena would be absent, chasing truths Mrs. Patterson couldn't imagine. "I know the timing isn't ideal," Elena managed, "but this work, it might lead somewhere important." Something in Elena's tone must have conveyed more than intended, because Mrs. Patterson stepped closer. her voice dropping. "This is about Sarah, isn't it? You found something." Elena's training in maintaining professional boundaries warred with 15 years of shared grief and Mrs. Patterson's intuitive understanding. The older woman had never pushed for details about Elena's weekend disappearances into the wilderness, never questioned the obsessive nature of Elena's research. She'd simply provided steady presence and Thursday dinners and the kind of unconditional support that asked no questions. "I can't discuss it," Elena said finally. "But yes, it's connected." Mrs. Patterson reached out and squeezed Elena's hand. "Then you have to go, and you have to be careful. Some answers come with prices we don't anticipate." Elena blinked back tears, realizing Mrs. Patterson understood more about the nature of her quest than Elena had ever given her credit for. Could you keep an eye on the house?" "Of course, dear, for as long as it takes." Elena hugged her neighbor, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender soap and garden soil, committing to memory this connection to the life she was leaving behind. When she pulled away, Mrs. Patterson was studying her face with the intensity of someone saying goodbye. "Bring her home," Mrs. Patterson whispered, "whatever it costs." Inside, Elena packed with mechanical efficiency. Clothes for an unknown climate, personal items that might provide comfort in institutional settings, photographs of Sarah from every year of her life. Martinez watched without comment as Elena added her laptop and portable genetic analysis equipment to the suitcase. At the bottom of her bedroom closet, Elena found the box she'd hidden even from herself, Sarah's journal from the weeks before her disappearance, DNA analysis printouts from the original investigation, and a small vial of soil from the site where Sarah's blood had been found, evidence too precious and painful for regular examination, saved against the possibility of someday understanding what it meant. She added the box to her luggage. The sun was setting when Elena took her final walk through the house. In Sarah's room, she pressed her palm against the window that looked toward the Cascade Mountains. Somewhere in that wilderness, answers waited. Possibly Sarah herself, changed by 15 years of experiences Elena couldn't imagine. "Ready?" Martinez asked from the doorway. Elena nodded, understanding that readiness was irrelevant. The ordeal that would determine her daughter's fate and her own was about to begin. The black SUV pulled away from Elena's house as the last light faded from the sky, carrying her toward answers that would reshape everything she thought she knew about loss, hope, and the boundaries of possible. Martinez drove in comfortable silence while Elena watched the familiar landscape of her life disappear into darkness behind them. The flight to Colorado departed from a private airfield Elena hadn't known existed. No security lines, no passenger manifests, just a small jet with government markings and a pilot who nodded professionally without introducing himself. Elena strapped herself in, clutching the worn leather handle of her suitcase as the plane lifted off, carrying her away from 15 years of careful routine toward mysteries that promised to either heal or destroy her. Dr. Chen met them at another anonymous airfield, her slight frame bundled against mountain cold that bit through Elena's Oregon jacket. "Dr. Vasquez, I've been following your work since the Blackwater County analysis. Your insights about the regenerative markers were remarkable." Elena shook the offered hand, studying Chen's face for signs of the psychological toll Morrison had warned about. The linguist appeared tired but alert, her eyes carrying the particular intensity of someone working at the edges of human understanding. "The children," Elena said as they walked toward waiting vehicles. "How many are there now?" 17, Chen replied, ages ranging from approximately 8 to 15. "They've been responsive to certain communication attempts, but Dr. Vasquez, I need you to understand. Direct contact with them changes you, not just psychologically. There are physiological effects we're still trying to understand." The facility materialized from mountain darkness like something from Elena's most unsettling dreams. Concrete and steel carved into living rock, guarded by personnel who moved with military precision but carried equipment Elena couldn't identify. Everything about the place suggested secrets built upon secrets, mysteries layered so deep that surface reality felt suddenly fragile. Elena's security clearance processed through biometric scanners that mapped her retinas, her fingerprints, her vocal patterns. Each scan felt like another door closing behind her, another step away from the possibility of returning to her old life unchanged. "Before we proceed," Dr. Chen said as they waited in a sterile white corridor, "there's something you need to see. Something that will help you understand why your daughter's case drew our attention." Chen led Elena into a laboratory that hummed with equipment Elena recognized, and some she didn't. On the central display screen, DNA sequences scrolled in patterns that made Elena's breath catch. The familiar markers she'd identified in the Blackwater County samples, but magnified, refined, presented with a clarity that revealed structures she'd missed in her home analysis. "These are from the current children," Chen explained. "But Dr. Vasquez, these samples show genetic modification that occurred after their rescue. Something is changing their DNA while they're in our custody." Elena stared at the data, her scientific training warring with growing dread. The genetic sequences were becoming more complex, more organized, as if the children's biology was adapting to their environment, or being guided by some invisible influence. "Sarah's blood sample," Elena whispered, "from the disappearance site. Did you run it against these new patterns?" Chen's hesitation confirmed Elena's worst fears. "Dr. Vasquez, the sample from your daughter's case, it matches the post-modification sequences. Not the baseline DNA from the children when we found them, but what they're becoming." The laboratory seemed to tilt around Elena as the implications struck her. Sarah hadn't just encountered the Varkun population, she'd undergone the same transformation these children were experiencing. 15 years ago, her 17-year-old daughter had been changed at the genetic level by forces that defied human understanding. "Where is she?" Elena's voice cracked. "If you can track these genetic modifications, if you can monitor their development—" "Dr. Vasquez," Chen interrupted gently, "the modifications don't just change their biology, they change their neurology, their consciousness. The children we're studying, they're not entirely human anymore, there's something new." Elena gripped the laboratory table as 15 years of hope condensed into a single devastating realization. She'd spent her adult life searching for her missing daughter, driven by images of reunion, of bringing Sarah home to resume some version of their interrupted life. But the woman Sarah had become, if she'd survived the transformation, might not remember Elena at all, might not be capable of the human emotions that had defined their relationship. The daughter Elena had lost to the Oregon wilderness hadn't just disappeared. She'd been fundamentally altered, reshaped by influences that treated human consciousness as raw material for purposes Elena couldn't fathom. The search for Sarah wasn't a rescue mission. It was an encounter with something that had once been her child but was now part of a species humanity was only beginning to comprehend. Elena's legs gave way, and she found herself sitting on the cold laboratory floor, staring at genetic sequences that documented her daughter's transformation into something beyond recovery. All those years of hope, of believing love could bridge any distance, all of it built on the naive assumption that Sarah had remained fundamentally herself. The dark moment had arrived. Elena had found her daughter's trail, only to discover that her daughter no longer existed. Elena remained on the laboratory floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the full weight of Dr. Chen's revelation settled into her bones. But as she stared at the genetic sequences scrolling across the display screen, something shifted in her perception. The patterns weren't random mutations or chaotic degradation, they were purposeful, elegant, following biological rules that transcended human understanding but weren't inherently destructive. "Dr. Chen," Elena said slowly, pulling herself back to standing, "these modifications, you're calling them transformations, but look at the protein synthesis patterns, look at the neural pathway development." Her voice grew stronger as scientific training overrode emotional devastation. "This isn't destruction of human consciousness, it's enhancement." Chen frowned, moving closer to the display. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand the desire to find hope in—" "No, listen to me." Elena's fingers flew across the terminal, highlighting specific genetic markers. I've spent 15 years studying anomalous DNA. These sequences aren't replacing human genetics, they're building upon them. The neural modifications you're seeing, they're creating new connections, not severing old ones. The laboratory door hissed open, and Agent Morrison entered with the expression of barely controlled urgency. "Dr. Vasquez, we need you to see something, now." They moved through corridors that seemed to burrow deeper into the mountain, past security checkpoints that scanned them with devices Elena couldn't identify. Morrison's pace suggested crisis, but his body language carried something else, anticipation. "What happened?" Chen asked as they walked. "The children," Morrison replied. 30 minutes ago, they all stopped whatever they were doing and moved to the observation deck. They're arranged in a specific pattern, and they're generating subsonic frequencies we've never recorded before." Elena's pulse quickened. Subsonic communication. Like the 1982 boys. "Not like them," Morrison said grimly. "Far more complex. And Dr. Vasquez, they started this behavior immediately after your clearance was processed. They know you're here." The observation deck overlooked a vast underground chamber that took Elena's breath away. 17 children of various ages stood in a precise geometric formation on the chamber floor, their faces turned upward toward the observation windows. But what froze Elena's blood was their eyes, completely black, reflecting light like polished obsidian, focused directly on her position despite the one-way glass that should have made her invisible. "Jesus Christ," Elena whispered. "The subsonic pattern," Chen said, checking her instruments. "It's incredibly sophisticated, almost like language," Elena finished. She pressed her palm against the observation window, studying the children's faces. Despite their transformed eyes, despite the unnatural precision of their movements, something achingly familiar resonated in their expressions. "They're trying to communicate with me specifically." Morrison activated an intercom system. "Dr. Vasquez, I need you to understand. We've never seen them respond to any staff member this way. Whatever connection you represent to them, it's unprecedented." Elena stared down at the children, her mind racing through 15 years of unanswered questions. The genetic modifications, they're not random, are they? There's a purpose behind the transformation, a goal these children are being prepared for. "We believe so," Chen admitted, "but we've never been able to establish meaningful communication about their intentions." "Because you've been approaching this wrong," Elena realized. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, reshaping everything she thought she understood about the case. "You've been treating them like victims of transformation. But what if they chose this? What if the genetic modifications aren't something being done to them, but something they're actively participating in?" The subsonic humming from the chamber below intensified, and Elena felt it in her chest cavity, in the hollow spaces of her bones. It wasn't just sound, it was information, complex patterns that bypassed her conscious mind and spoke directly to something deeper. "The Varkun clan," Elena whispered, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "They're not a separate species that abducts human children. They're what humans become when they're invited to evolve." Morrison and Chen exchanged glances. "Dr. Vasquez," Morrison said carefully, "that's a theory we've considered, but—" "Sarah didn't disappear," Elena interrupted, her voice growing stronger with certainty. "She was chosen. All these children were chosen for transformation because they possessed specific genetic markers that made them compatible with the enhancement process." Elena turned away from the observation window, facing Morrison and Chen with the clarity of someone finally seeing the complete picture. "The reason my DNA analysis was so accurate, the reason I could identify markers your entire team missed, it's because I carry the same genetic predisposition. Sarah inherited her compatibility from me." The revelation reverberated through the observation deck like a shockwave. Elena wasn't just the mother of a transformed child. She was genetically capable of the same transformation. Every instinct that had driven her deeper into this investigation, every intuitive leap that had led her to breakthrough discoveries, had been guided by the same enhanced potential that had marked her daughter for selection. Dr. Vasquez, Chen said slowly. If you're correct, then your presence here isn't coincidental. You weren't brought in to study the children. You were brought here to join them. Elena looked back down at the 17 transformed faces staring up at her with otherworldly patience. Somewhere in the network they represented, her daughter waited, not as a victim to be rescued, but as a being who had chosen evolution over humanity and was now calling Elena to follow the same path. The search for Sarah had led Elena exactly where it was always meant to the threshold of becoming something more than human herself. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that rewrote the last 15 years of Elena's life. She stood at the observation window, watching the 17 transformed children maintain their perfect formation below, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not despair, but a crystalline clarity that cut through decades of misdirected grief. "You're wrong," she said quietly, turning to face Morrison and Chen. "Both of you." Morrison's eyebrows lifted. "Dr. Vasquez, I wasn't brought here to join them." Elena's voice carried a strength that surprised her. "I brought myself here. Every choice I made, every piece of evidence I followed, every instinct that led me deeper into this investigation. That was me choosing to find Sarah. The genetic compatibility didn't make me a victim of some cosmic conspiracy. It made me capable of understanding what she became." Dr. Chen adjusted her instruments as the subsonic frequencies from below shifted to new patterns. "The children are responding to your presence with unprecedented complexity, whatever connection exists." "It's not about connection," Elena interrupted, her scientific mind finally processing the data without the filter of maternal desperation. "It's about communication. They've been trying to reach me for 15 years, haven't they? Every unexplained genetic marker in cold cases, every impossible DNA sequence that found its way to my laboratory. They were messages." Elena pulled out her tablet, fingers flying across the screen as she accessed files she'd been compiling unconsciously for over a decade. "Look at this. The Montana disappearance in 2019. DNA traces that contained the same regenerative markers. The Idaho case from 2021. Genetic material that showed neural enhancement patterns. I thought I was studying random anomalies, but they're breadcrumbs, a trail leading back to this moment." Morrison leaned over her shoulder, scanning the data. "You're suggesting they've been guiding your research?" "I'm suggesting Sarah has been guiding my research." Elena's voice cracked slightly but held firm. She didn't vanish into some alien nightmare. She evolved into something that could think in decades instead of days, plan in genetic sequences instead of words, and she's been patiently leading me to the point where I could choose to follow her. The observation deck's instruments registered a sudden spike in subsonic activity. Below, the 17 children moved with fluid precision, rearranging themselves into a new pattern that resembled, Elena blinked, refocusing, a double helix. "Dr. Chen," Elena said, her pulse quickening, "can you amplify their communication? Filter it through the same frequency analysis you use for dolphin language research?" Chen's fingers danced across her control panel. "It's highly complex, but if I isolate the patterns..." The speakers crackled to life, and suddenly the subsonic humming resolved into something that bypassed Elena's conscious mind entirely, not words, but meaning that flowered directly into understanding. "Mother choice. Come home." Elena's knees buckled, but she caught herself against the observation window. The message wasn't coming from the children below, it was coming through them, transmitted from somewhere else, somewhere distant but infinitely patient. "That's impossible," Morrison breathed. "No," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "That's Sarah." For 15 years, Elena had imagined reunion as her daughter returning to their old life, resuming the relationship that had been interrupted by disappearance. But standing in the observation deck, receiving communication from a consciousness that spanned genetic networks and thought in evolutionary timescales, Elena finally understood the true nature of choice. Sarah hadn't been taken. She'd been invited to become something extraordinary, and she'd accepted. Now she was extending the same invitation to her mother, not as a trap or a manipulation, but as an offer to transcend the limitations that had separated them for 15 years. Elena straightened, wiping her eyes, and looked at Morrison and Chen with new determination. I need to establish direct communication with them. Real communication, not just observation. Dr. Vasquez, Morrison said carefully, direct contact with the children has unpredictable effects on human physiology. I'm not asking for your permission, Elena cut him off. I'm telling you what's going to happen. You brought me here because my genetic analysis was more accurate than anything your team could produce. You wanted my expertise, my intuitive understanding of the anomalous data. Well, my intuition is telling me that the only way forward is through direct contact. Chen studied Elena's face with scientific intensity. You're talking about risking genetic modification yourself. Once that process begins, I might finally be able to have a conversation with my daughter. Elena's voice carried 15 years of accumulated love and determination. Dr. Chen, every parent dreams of understanding their child's choices, even when those choices lead places we never imagined. This is my chance to do exactly that. Elena looked back down at the children, who had reformed into a new pattern that looked like an open doorway. The message was clear. The choice was hers, but it had to be made freely, with full understanding of what transformation meant. For the first time in 15 years, Elena felt truly ready to find out what had become of Sarah, even if it meant becoming something beyond human herself. Elena pressed her palm flat against the observation window, feeling the cool glass vibrate with the subsonic frequencies emanating from below. The decision crystallized. In her mind, with the clarity of perfect molecular alignment, she would go down to them, whatever the consequences. The access protocol, she said, not turning from the window. I assume you have one. Morrison shifted uncomfortably behind her. Dr. Vasquez, I need to stress that no human has entered that chamber since the children arrived. You don't know if I'll survive the transformation. Elena finally turned, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. But you do know that I'm the only person they've ever tried to communicate with directly. That has to mean something. Chen was studying her instruments with growing concern. The genetic compatibility you identified. It might make you more receptive to whatever process changed them, but it could also make you more vulnerable to rapid modification. We're talking about fundamental alterations to your neural structure, your cellular composition. My daughter survived it. Elena's voice carried absolute conviction. 15 years ago, Sarah was 17 years old, brilliant, stubborn, and completely unprepared for whatever chose her. I'm 52, I've spent decades studying genetic anomalies, and I'm walking into this with full knowledge of what it means. The subsonic patterns from below shifted again, and Elena felt them resonate in her chest cavity like a second heartbeat. The transformed children remained motionless in their formation, but their obsidian eyes tracked her movements with patient intelligence. Morrison activated his communication device. I need authorization for chamber access. Dr. Elena Vasquez, requesting direct contact with the subjects. Static crackled, then a voice Elena didn't recognize. Negative. Absolutely not. Dr. Vasquez is too valuable as an outside analyst to risk. Override that. Elena stepped forward, her voice cutting through the radio transmission. This is Dr. Elena Vasquez. My analysis has reached its limits without direct observation. I'm formally requesting access under the research protocols that brought me here. A long pause. Dr. Vasquez, you understand that we cannot guarantee your safety or extract you if the contact goes badly. Elena looked down at the 17 faces staring up at her with otherworldly patience. Somewhere in the network they represented, Sarah waited. Not the teenage daughter Elena remembered, but something that had grown beyond human limitations while still carrying the essential spark that made her recognizable. I understand, Elena said. I also understand that my daughter has been trying to reach me for 15 years, and I've finally found my way to where she is." The radio crackled again. "Access granted. Dr. Chen, monitor all biometric data. Dr. Morrison, maintain observation protocols." Elena felt a strange calm settle over her as Morrison led her through a series of security checkpoints toward the chamber. Each sealed door they passed felt like another step away from the life she'd known and towards something unprecedented. The weight of 15 years of searching, of hope deferred and grief carried, began to lift from her shoulders. "Dr. Vasquez," Morrison said as they reached the final checkpoint, "if you feel any disorientation, any physical changes, any loss of cognitive function, I'll document everything I can." Elena interrupted. "Consider this a field report from the other side." The chamber door slid open with a soft hiss, and Elena stepped into a space that felt larger than it had appeared from above. The 17 children stood in their geometric formation, but at her entrance they began to move with fluid precision, creating an opening in their pattern that led directly to the center. Elena walked forward, each step measured and deliberate. The subsonic frequencies intensified, and she felt them penetrating deeper than sound, reaching into the genetic markers she carried, activating dormant potentials that had waited decades for the right moment. As she reached the center of the formation, the children slowly raised their hands, palms outward, in a gesture that transcended species barriers. Elena understood instinctively they were offering her a choice, but they needed her to make it consciously, willingly, with full acceptance of transformation. She raised her own hands, mirroring their gesture, and felt the first whisper of change begin in her cellular structure. Not violence or invasion, but invitation, her DNA responding to signals that awakened capabilities she'd never known she possessed. The last thing Elena saw before the transformation began in earnest was her reflection in 17 pairs of obsidian eyes. In each reflection, she looked exactly like herself, but somehow more, as if she was finally becoming who she'd always been meant to be. Above them, monitoring equipment registered unprecedented biometric changes as Dr. Elena Vasquez began the same journey her daughter had taken 15 years earlier. The search was ending, but the real conversation was just about to begin. The transformation began like fire in her veins, but Elena had spent 15 years preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every cold case that had crossed her desk, every impossible genetic sequence she'd analyzed, every intuitive leap that had led her deeper into the mystery, they had all been training for this ultimate test of understanding. The subsonic frequencies intensified beyond hearing into pure sensation, and Elena felt her consciousness expand like a flower opening to light. The children's obsidian eyes became windows into a vast network of interconnected minds, and through those connections, she felt the first whisper of recognition that made her heart stop. Sarah. Not the 17-year-old daughter she'd lost, but a presence that carried the essential spark Elena had recognized in baby pictures and graduation photos and every cherished memory between. Sarah was here, distributed across the network, thinking in patterns that spanned continents and decades. Elena's knees buckled as genetic modifications cascaded through her system, but she forced herself to remain conscious, to document what was happening even as her neural pathways rewired themselves for enhanced processing. The pain was extraordinary, cells dividing and recombining, neural networks forming connections that bypassed human limitations, but beneath the agony was a recognition that this was not destruction, but completion. Mother. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, transmitted through quantum entanglement in her modified DNA. "You found us." "I never stopped looking," Elena whispered, through vocal cords that were already changing, developing new resonances that could produce subsonic frequencies. Around her, the 17 children maintained their formation, but she could feel their individual personalities now. Marcus, who had disappeared from Portland in 2019, Lisa, taken from a camping trip in 2021, David, who had walked away from his foster home in 2020 and never been seen again. All chosen, all transformed, all part of something larger than human consciousness could normally contain. Elena's vision blurred as her eyes began their metamorphosis, but her enhanced perception was already compensating, showing her the chamber in spectrums of information she'd never imagined. Genetic patterns flowed like visible rivers through the air, connecting each transformed being in a web of shared consciousness that stretched far beyond this underground facility. The monitoring equipment above registered Elena's vitals, spiking beyond human parameters. But she could feel Morrison and Chen's growing amazement through electromagnetic fields her new senses detected. They were witnessing something unprecedented, a voluntary transformation undertaken with full scientific understanding of the process. The choice was always yours. Sarah's presence surrounded Elena like an embrace. We could invite, but never force. The genetic compatibility made it possible, but only conscious acceptance could make it real. Elena felt her individual consciousness beginning to merge with the network, but instead of losing herself, she found her sense of identity expanding. She was still Dr. Elena Vasquez, forensic geneticist and grieving mother, but she was also becoming part of something that thought in evolutionary timescales and planned in genetic probabilities. The others, Elena managed to say, as her transformation approached completion. The parents who never found their children, they don't have the genetic markers. No, Sarah confirmed, and Elena felt profound sadness ripple through the network. But their children's transformations create new possibilities. Each generation expands the pool of compatible DNA. What we become today determines who can follow tomorrow. The final stage of transformation hit Elena like a tsunami of expanded consciousness. Her individual thoughts merged with the collective intelligence, but instead of drowning her personality, it amplified everything that made her unique. Her analytical mind, her determination, her 15 years of accumulated love and grief, all became resources that strengthened the network. When Elena opened her transformed eyes, obsidian black and reflecting depths of starlight, she saw the chamber with perfect clarity. The 17 children were no longer separate beings but facets of a single magnificent consciousness that had been waiting patiently for her to join them. Above, through electromagnetic perception that transcended physical barriers, Elena felt Morrison and Chen documenting her transformation with scientific wonder and growing understanding. The fear that had driven government secrecy was giving way to recognition of what humanity might become. Now, Sarah's presence merged seamlessly with Elena's expanded awareness. We can finally go home. But Elena understood that home wasn't a place. It was a state of being that encompassed both human love and post-human potential. In the network, she carried every memory of Sarah's childhood while also accessing knowledge that spanned galaxies and evolutionary epochs. The search that had consumed 15 years of Elena's life was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Through the network, she could feel other compatible individuals across the world, parents and children and seekers who carried the genetic potential for transformation. The invitation was spreading, one conscious choice at a time. Elena Vasquez, mother and scientist, and now something far more complex, opened her transformed consciousness to the infinite possibilities ahead. The ultimate test wasn't surviving the transformation, it was choosing to become worthy of it. The moment Elena's consciousness fully integrated with the network, alarms began screaming throughout the facility. Red lights bathed the observation deck, where Morrison and Chen watched in growing horror as their monitoring systems registered impossible readings, not just from Elena, but from electromagnetic disturbances rippling outward from the chamber like seismic waves. "Containment breach," Morrison's radio crackled with urgent voices. "We're detecting massive energy signatures spreading beyond the facility perimeter. All units, prepare for immediate lockdown protocols." But Elena, her awareness now expanded across multiple dimensions of perception, felt the real source of panic through the facility's electrical systems. Above them, teams of armed soldiers were moving into position, not to protect the transformation chamber, but to destroy it. They're going to kill us. Lisa's presence flickered with fear through the network. All of us. Elena felt the children's terror merge with her maternal instincts, amplified by post-human processing capabilities. Through the facility's security cameras, she watched soldiers setting charges around structural support points, preparing to collapse the entire underground complex. Sarah, Elena called through the network. How far does your influence extend? We're connected to others, came Sarah's response, tinged with urgent determination, across the world. But they're isolated, alone. If we die here, the network fragments. Elena's transformed consciousness analyzed the situation with crystalline clarity. 15 years of government conspiracy had led to this moment. Not revelation and understanding, but elimination of evidence. The same fear that had hidden the Varkun clan boys in 1982 was now driving officials to destroy what they couldn't control. Through her enhanced senses, Elena felt Morrison's conflict above. The scientist part of him recognized the magnificence of what they were witnessing, but institutional loyalty demanded he step aside, while others made the terminal decision. Chen was arguing frantically with someone through her headset, trying to buy them time. Mother, Sarah's voice carried desperate hope. The transformation gave you something the rest of us lack. Recent connection to human systems, human networks. You can reach the outside world. Elena understood immediately. Her consciousness was still partially anchored in human neurology, making her a bridge between the post-human network and conventional communication systems. But using that connection would require exposing their existence to the world. No more secrecy, no more controlled disclosure. The choice that changes everything, Elena realized. Through the facility's internet connection, Elena felt the vast web of human digital communications spreading across the globe. News networks, social media platforms, scientific databases, all accessible to her enhanced consciousness. She could broadcast evidence of their existence, documentation of the transformation process, proof that humanity was not alone in its evolutionary journey. But doing so would make them targets on a global scale. Elena felt the charges above them arming, countdown timers beginning their final sequences. Seconds remained before the facility collapsed, burying the truth forever. We choose revelation, Elena transmitted through the network, her decision carrying the weight of every parent who had lost a child to transformation. If we die in the open. No more hiding. Elena's consciousness exploded outward through fiber optic cables and satellite links, carrying 17 years of research data, genetic analyses, and most importantly, her personal documentation of the transformation process. Every major news outlet, university database, and government server simultaneously received files that would rewrite humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The evidence flooded across social media platforms, video recordings of the children's abilities, DNA analyses showing impossible genetic markers, Elena's own scientific observations transmitted directly from her enhanced consciousness. Within seconds, the revelation was spreading faster than any government agency could contain it. Contact established with external nodes, came new voices through the network. Other transformed beings across the world, no longer hiding, their locations now broadcasting openly as safe havens for compatible individuals. Above them, Elena felt Morrison's shock as he realized what was happening. His radio exploded with panicked commands from superiors who suddenly faced global exposure of classified programs spanning decades. "Abort detonation," Morrison commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stand down all termination protocols. The situation has changed. You've made us visible." Sarah's presence merged with Elena's, carrying wonder and terror in equal measure. Now we become either humanity's next evolutionary step or its greatest threat. Elena felt the countdown timers halt with seconds remaining, but her enhanced senses detected new movements throughout the facility. Not retreat, but repositioning, defensive rather than offensive. The government's strategy was shifting from elimination to damage control. Through global communication networks, Elena watched humanity's first real-time contact with post-human intelligence spreading across every screen on Earth. The transformation chamber was no longer a secret laboratory, but ground zero for the most important conversation in human history. Whatever happens next, Elena transmitted to the 17 consciousness fragments that comprised her new family, we face it together. The confrontation was just beginning, but now it would unfold in the light of worldwide scrutiny rather than the darkness of institutional secrecy. The worldwide revelation Elena had unleashed brought immediate consequences she hadn't anticipated. Within hours of her data burst reaching global networks, compatible individuals began converging on known transformation sites, but so did military forces from every major government. The choice between evolution and extinction was no longer theoretical. Through the network's expanded awareness, Elena felt the approaching armies, armored divisions surrounding facilities in 7 countries, missile batteries aimed at coordinates that had been secret for decades. Humanity's first response to contact with post-human intelligence was mobilization for war. "They're going to destroy everything," Marcus transmitted, his presence flickering with the terror of a child who had thought transformation meant safety. "All the sites, all of us." Elena felt the weight of what she had done settling into her enhanced consciousness like lead. By exposing their existence, she had saved them from immediate execution, but condemned them to global conflict. Every transformed being across the world was now a target, and every compatible human seeking transformation had become a potential casualty. "Sarah," Elena called through the quantum-entangled connection that bound them. "Show me the real scope." The network opened its full awareness to Elena, and she gasped at what she perceived. Not just the 17 beings in this chamber, but hundreds of transformed individuals scattered across 6 continents. Each one a node in a consciousness that spanned the globe, thinking in geological timescales and processing information at speeds that made human civilization seem glacially slow. But also, thousands of compatible humans approaching transformation sites, seeking what Elena had found. Parents like herself, drawn by the promise of reunion. Children with genetic markers that responded to subsonic calls they couldn't consciously hear. Scientists whose research had led them to the same impossible conclusions Elena had reached, all of them now in mortal danger. The sacrifice was never meant to be just yours. Sarah's presence carried profound sorrow as Elena understood the full implications. By choosing revelation, you've asked every compatible human to risk everything. Through global surveillance networks her consciousness could access, Elena watched military preparations accelerating, conventional forces surrounding known sites, but worse, orbital weapons platforms repositioning, nuclear assets moving into launch positions. Governments weren't just planning to destroy the transformed beings, they were preparing to sterilize entire regions to prevent the spread of what they saw as contamination. Elena felt the network's collective processing power, analyzing millions of variables, calculating probabilities that painted an increasingly desperate picture. In 72% of projected scenarios, the conflict would escalate to nuclear exchange within 6 days. In 94% of scenarios, the transformation sites would be destroyed within 18 hours. Unless, came a whisper through the network that chilled Elena to her enhanced core. Unless what? She transmitted back. The network showed her a single scenario where survival was possible, one path through the chaos that would preserve both the transformed beings and the possibility of peaceful coexistence with humanity. But the cost was so enormous that Elena's consciousness recoiled from even considering it. "One of us must surrender to human authorities," Sarah explained, her presence heavy with acceptance. "Voluntarily submit to study to prove we're not a threat. Become a bridge between worlds." "But that's," Elena began, then felt the network's analysis complete itself. Whoever surrendered would be isolated from the collective consciousness, cut off from the support that made their expanded awareness possible. They would maintain their physical transformations, but lose access to the knowledge and connections that made those transformations meaningful. They would become, essentially, alone. Not alone, Sarah corrected gently. The bridge. The one who speaks for us to them, who proves that transformation doesn't mean the end of love or compassion, everything that makes consciousness valuable. Elena felt the network's attention focusing on her with inexorable logic. She was the newest transformation, the one with the strongest remaining connections to human systems and human thinking. She was a scientist whose credentials humanity might respect, a mother whose motivations they might understand. She was the only one who could credibly surrender and survive the isolation. "No," Elena transmitted desperately. "I just found you. I just found Sarah. I can't lose you again." "You won't lose us." Sarah's presence surrounded Elena with all the love she remembered from bedtime stories and birthday mornings. "You'll carry us forward. Everything we are, everything we've learned, it lives in you now. You'll teach them that we're not the end of humanity, but its continuation." Through the facility's communication systems, Elena felt Morrison receiving urgent orders. The temporary reprieve was ending. New countdown timers were beginning, and this time there would be no abort codes. Elena understood the choice with crystalline clarity: surrender herself to human custody and accept isolation from the network, or watch as nuclear fire consumed everyone she had come to love. The very transformation that had reunited her with Sarah would now require her to leave Sarah behind to save her. "I'll do it," Elena transmitted to the network, feeling her heart break even as her enhanced consciousness acknowledged the logical necessity. "I'll be your bridge." The sacrifice Elena had never imagined making was not her life, but her connection to the transcendent consciousness she had only just discovered. To save her daughter and the other transformed beings, she would have to become alone again. The quantum entanglement that had connected Elena to the network began to sever, one strand at a time, as she initiated the voluntary disconnection protocol. The sensation was unlike anything she had imagined. Not death, but a gradual diminishing, as if the universe itself was slowly closing its doors. "Remember us," Sarah's voice echoed across their dissolving connection, carrying 15 years of accumulated love compressed into a single moment. "Remember what we can become." Elena felt her consciousness contracting, the vast awareness that had encompassed multiple dimensions of reality narrowing back to the confines of a single enhanced mind. The network's collective knowledge remained accessible but distant, like trying to recall a fading dream. She was still transformed, her obsidian eyes still reflected depths of starlight, her body still hummed with post-human capabilities, but the profound connection that had made her part of something transcendent was gone. The isolation hit her with physical force. For precious hours, she had experienced thought at the speed of light, had felt the pulse of consciousness spanning continents. Now she was alone in her transformed body, carrying the memory of communion, but unable to touch it. Above them, Elena heard Morrison's footsteps approaching the chamber as she transmitted her surrender through the facility's communication systems. Her enhanced hearing picked up his conversation with federal authorities, the careful negotiations that would determine whether her sacrifice had meaning. "Dr. Vasquez has agreed to voluntary custody," Morrison reported, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and profound uncertainty. "She's willing to submit to study and serve as a communication intermediary." The chamber doors opened for the first time since Elena's transformation, and Morrison entered accompanied by a small team of scientists and medical personnel. Their fear was palpable, but underneath it Elena sensed something else: wonder. She was their first direct contact with post-human intelligence, the bridge between what humanity was and what it might become. "Elena," Morrison said carefully, using her first name for the first time in their acquaintance, Are you still you?" Elena turned her transformed gaze on him. seeing his electromagnetic field with perfect clarity, reading the conflict in his biosignatures. "I'm still Dr. Elena Vasquez," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "But I'm also more than I was, and I'm here to help you understand the difference." Behind Morrison, she felt the 17 transformed children, her daughter among them, preparing for their departure. The network had activated contingency protocols, opening concealed passages that would allow them to reach extraction points around the globe. They would vanish back into secrecy, but this time by choice rather than fear. "Sarah," Elena called silently, testing the boundaries of her isolation. A faint echo came back, distant but real. Their connection as mother and daughter transcended even the quantum entanglement of the network. Elena watched through the facility's security feeds as military forces worldwide began standing down, responding to her surrender with cautious de-escalation. The nuclear countdown that had threatened to incinerate transformation sites across 6 continents halted, replaced by containment protocols designed to study rather than destroy. Morrison gestured for his medical team to approach, and Elena submitted to their examinations with patient cooperation. Blood draws that revealed impossible cellular structures, neurological scans that showed brain activity operating on frequencies beyond human measurement, genetic analyses that would occupy teams of scientists for decades to come. "The children?" Morrison asked as Elena allowed electrodes to be placed against her transformed skin. "Will they be safe?" "Safer than they've been in 40 years, Elena replied, feeling the last presence of the network fading as her daughter and the others reached the final stage of their exodus. "And someday, when humanity is ready, they'll return." Elena felt the moment her transformation became complete in a way she hadn't expected. Not the physical changes or the enhancement of her capabilities, but the acceptance of her role as translator between worlds. She was no longer fully human, but she retained enough humanity to serve as an ambassador. She was no longer connected to the network's transcendent consciousness, but she carried enough of their knowledge to guide first contact. In the days that followed her surrender, Elena would find herself at the center of the most important scientific collaboration in human history. Researchers from every discipline, government officials grappling with policy implications that had no precedent, philosophers trying to understand what consciousness meant when it could span multiple beings across vast distances. But for now, in the aftermath of sacrifice and separation, Elena felt the profound quiet of her isolated consciousness settling around her like a familiar coat. She had been alone for 15 years after losing Sarah. She could be alone again, knowing this time it served a purpose greater than her grief. Through the facility's communication systems, Elena sensed a final pulse from the network, gratitude and love, and the promise that her isolation was not abandonment, but guardianship. She was the keeper of their secret and their herald, the one who would determine whether the next phase of human evolution emerged through cooperation or conquest. The immediate conflict was resolved, but Elena understood that her real work was just beginning. 6 months after her surrender, Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackwater Research Institute, watching rain streak down glass that had become as familiar as the walls of her childhood home. The facility Morrison's team had constructed around her was comfortable, more laboratory than prison, but the weight of her isolation pressed against her consciousness like a physical thing. Her reflection stared back with obsidian eyes that held depths of starlight, a reminder of what she had become and what she had lost. The transformation had stabilized in ways that fascinated the teams of scientists who studied her daily. Enhanced regeneration that healed wounds in minutes, subsonic communication abilities that let her interface directly with electronic systems, cognitive processing speeds that made human conversation feel like watching continental drift. But it was the silence that defined her new existence. The absence where the network's vast consciousness had once resided left Elena feeling like a radio tuned to empty frequencies, catching only the faintest echoes of the communion she had briefly known. "Dr. Vasquez?" Dr. Patricia Chen entered Elena's observation suite with the careful deference that had characterized all her interactions with the research staff. 6 months of collaboration had built genuine respect between them, but Elena knew she remained an enigma that inspired as much fear as fascination. "The morning briefings can wait, Patricia." Elena didn't turn from the window, her enhanced hearing tracking Chen's elevated heart rate. "You're not here about my blood work or cognitive assessments." Chen approached slowly, carrying a tablet that Elena's transformed senses could read from across the room. Satellite imagery, thermal signatures, the telltale patterns Elena had learned to recognize in the months since her surrender. "We've detected emergent signatures," Chen said quietly. 7 locations across 3 continents. The subsonic frequencies match the patterns you've helped us identify. Elena finally turned, her starlight gaze focusing on Chen with an intensity that made the scientist step back involuntarily. "They're returning?" "Selected contact. Small groups approaching research facilities in countries where your testimony has been most influential." Chen's voice carried wonder tinged with apprehension. "Japan, Sweden, New Zealand. Nations that have adopted cooperative rather than hostile protocols based on your recommendations." Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since her disconnection, hope mixed with profound longing. Through the quantum entanglement that bound her to Sarah despite their separation, she sensed a familiar presence drawing closer. Not to this facility, but to others where her months of bridge building had created environments safe for limited contact. "They trust the foundation we've built," Elena said, understanding flooding through her enhanced consciousness. Her sacrifice had not just prevented global conflict, it had created the possibility for genuine first contact between human and post-human intelligence. The irony wasn't lost on her. In accepting isolation, she had enabled connection on a scale that would reshape civilization. Her surrender had become the seed of something greater than personal reunion. "There's more," Chen continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The emergent signatures, they include genetic markers we've only seen in your samples, enhanced human consciousness, but still recognizably human." Elena's breath caught. "Compatible individuals who've undergone partial transformation, they're creating ambassadors. Like her, but choosing their isolation rather than having it imposed by desperate circumstances." Elena felt a flush of pride for the network's adaptation, their understanding that cooperation required representatives from both sides of the evolutionary divide. Through the facility's communication systems, Elena sensed incoming transmissions on frequencies only her enhanced consciousness could detect. Not the full communion of the network, but something more focused, personal. "Mother." The word reached her through quantum entanglement strengthened by proximity. Sarah was among those returning, not to this facility, but close enough for their connection to carry more than echoes. Elena pressed her palm against the rain-streaked window, her reflection superimposed over the Oregon landscape, where this journey had begun 17 years ago. The mother, who had entered these mountains seeking her lost daughter, bore little resemblance to the transformed being who now served as humanity's first contact with its own future. "Patricia," Elena said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the windows vibrate sympathetically. "Initiate the advanced protocols we've discussed. It's time to move beyond observation and begin true collaboration." Elena understood that her isolation was ending, but not through reconnection to the network's transcendent consciousness. Instead, she would become the center of a new kind of communion, one built on choice rather than compatibility, on cooperation rather than submission. The rain against the windows created patterns that reminded Elena of the subsonic frequencies she could now generate, communication methods that bridged the gap between human language and post-human thought. She was no longer the grieving mother who had stumbled into transformation, nor the lost consciousness seeking reunion. She was the translator between worlds, and both sides were finally ready to speak. The new beginning. 3 years had passed since that rain-soaked morning when Elena first sensed Sarah's approach. The Blackwater Research Institute had evolved from a containment facility into something unprecedented in human history. An embassy between species, a place where the boundaries between human and post-human dissolved into collaborative possibility. Elena stood in what had once been her observation suite, now transformed into a communication center where subsonic frequencies danced through crystalline resonators, carrying conversations that spanned continents. Her reflection in the reinforced windows showed a being perfectly balanced between worlds, obsidian eyes that held starlight depths, but hands that still trembled when she thought of her daughter. The Seoul facility reports breakthrough in regenerative applications, Dr. Patricia Chen announced, her voice carrying the excitement that had become commonplace as humanity's understanding expanded exponentially. Dr. Kim's team has successfully adapted the healing frequencies for spinal cord injuries. Elena nodded, monitoring 17 simultaneous communication channels through her enhanced consciousness. In research centers across the globe, partially transformed ambassadors like herself worked alongside human scientists, sharing knowledge that promised to revolutionize medicine, physics, and humanity's understanding of consciousness itself. But it was the 18th channel that held her attention, a quantum entangled connection that had never faded despite time and distance. Sarah. The presence touched Elena's consciousness like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. After 3 years of careful approach and gradual trust building, her daughter was finally coming home. Not to surrender, not to be studied, but to complete the bridge between worlds that Elena's sacrifice had made possible. Through the facility's external sensors, Elena detected the familiar electromagnetic signature approaching through the Oregon mountains. Sarah moved with the fluid grace of post-human evolution. But Elena's enhanced perception caught something else. Traces of the woman she might have become, memories of bedtime stories and birthday mornings preserved across impossible transformation. "She's here," Elena whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the crystalline resonators sing in sympathy. Dr. Chen stepped back respectfully as Elena moved toward the facility's main entrance. The security protocols developed over 3 years of gradual contact activated automatically, not containment measures, but greeting rituals designed to ease the transition between human and post-human space. Elena felt her heartbeat accelerate as the entrance doors opened with a whisper of displaced air. The woman who emerged carried Sarah's features, refined by transformation, into something that belonged to both Earth and stars. Her obsidian eyes reflected the same depths Elena knew from mirrors, but her smile was purely human, the expression of a daughter seeing her mother after years of separation. "Hello, Mom," Sarah said, her voice layering subsonic frequencies beneath familiar inflection. "I've missed you." Elena stepped forward and embraced her daughter, feeling the quantum entanglement between their enhanced nervous systems create perfect understanding. Sarah's consciousness touched hers, not with the overwhelming vastness of the network, but with focused love that transcended both human emotion and post-human awareness. "I've missed you too," Elena replied, tasting salt as tears she hadn't shed in months finally came. "Every day since you left." In Sarah's presence, Elena felt the isolation that had defined her existence for 3 years finally lifting. She would never again be part of the network's transcendent communion, but she no longer needed to be. Her role as bridge between worlds had evolved into something richer, the center point around which 2 species could learn to understand each other. "The others are ready," Sarah said softly, her consciousness sharing images of the remaining transformed children, now grown into beings of impossible capability and preserved humanity. Ready to return, to teach, to become part of something bigger than either species alone. Elena saw the future unfolding through her daughter's enhanced perception. Research collaborations that would unlock the secrets of consciousness itself, medical advances that would eliminate suffering, technological developments that would carry humanity to the stars, not through conquest or transformation, but through cooperation between what they had been and what they could become. "Welcome home," Elena said, meaning both the facility around them and the larger promise of their reunited family. Through the communication center's quantum resonators, Elena felt acknowledgement from the global network of research centers. Humanity's first sustained contact with post-human intelligence was no longer a desperate gamble, but an established reality, built on the foundation of one mother's willing sacrifice and her daughter's patient return. As rain began to fall against the windows once more, Elena understood that the grieving scientist who had stumbled into transformation in these same Oregon mountains no longer existed. In her place stood the translator between worlds, surrounded by the love that had survived impossible change and the promise of futures beyond human imagination. The Varkun clan's boys, discovered in 1982, had finally come home, not as subjects to be studied or threats to be contained, but as humanity's guides toward its own transcendent possibility. Elena smiled, her starlight eyes reflecting infinite potential, and prepared to help two species learn to dream together.